It was a bright, calm afternoon in London with the sun casting a warm glow over the streets. Tourists and locals alike gathered near Buckingham Palace, eager to see the famous royal guards. These guards were known for their stiff, unblinking stances and the way they stood still, not even flinching at the sounds and movements around them. It was a performance of discipline and control that many had traveled far to witness. Mr. Thompson, a retired military veteran, was one of those tourists. He had spent most of his life serving in various parts of the world, protecting his country. After his retirement, he found peace in quiet moments like these, watching history unfold before him. He stood near the back of the crowd, observing the guards, his hands resting casually in his pockets. His weathered face showed the calmness that came from years of experience. Today was no different from any other day he'd spent in the city, or so he thought. As the crowd gathered, children ran around laughing. Some adults took pictures, and the air was filled with the hum of conversation. It was a perfect day for sightseeing. The tourists didn't seem to mind the heat or the long wait for the guards to make their shift change. They were all excited to see the ceremony, to take home a story they could share with their friends and family. Among these tourists, there was one man who stood out, a young man dressed in flashy clothes, his demeanor loud and attention-seeking. This young man weaved in and out of the crowd, making his way towards the royal guards with a swagger that caught everyone's eye. He was clearly enjoying the attention, his voice booming as he shouted jokes and laughed at nothing in particular. He seemed to think that his loud behavior would make him the center of attention. Some people glanced at him nervously, unsure if he was just trying to make a scene or if he was actually looking for trouble. Mr. Thompson noticed the man as soon as he entered the crowd. He could tell from the way the young man moved, his overconfidence, his disregard for the people around him, that he was trouble. The veteran had seen enough in his lifetime to know when a person was out of line. He kept an eye on him, wondering what the young man might do next. As the minutes passed, the man continued to act louder and more out of control until he was standing directly in front of the royal guards. It was at this point that the young man did something that caught everyone's attention. He began mocking the royal guards, laughing loudly and making exaggerated gestures. His actions were disrespectful, and the people around him began to take notice. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by his behavior. Mr. Thompson's brow furrowed. He had seen enough disrespect in his life to know when it had gone too far. He couldn't stand by and watch any longer. With a calm but firm voice, he spoke out. "You should show some respect," he said, his tone steady. He didn't raise his voice, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. The young man turned, startled, his attention shifting from the guards to Mr. Thompson. The veteran's words had hit their mark. But instead of backing down, the young man smirked, his arrogance growing even stronger. What happened next would be something neither the veteran nor the crowd could have predicted. The young man, now fully aware of the veteran's presence, sneered at Mr. Thompson. He looked the older man up and down, sizing him up with a dismissive expression. There was no hint of fear in his eyes, only defiance. He had been causing trouble for a while, and the crowd around him was growing uneasy. The tension was thick, and it felt as if something was about to break. Instead of apologizing or backing away, the young man squared up to Mr. Thompson. He pointed a finger toward the veteran's face and began speaking in a mocking tone. "Who do you think you are?" he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can tell me what to do? You're just an old man. Maybe you should mind your own business." The crowd murmured, some people glancing nervously at the royal guards. Even though the guards stood motionless, their eyes seemed to follow every move. The air around them was still, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Tourists pulled out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something out of the ordinary. The situation had shifted from a light-hearted moment to a tense confrontation. Mr. Thompson didn't flinch. He had seen people like this before, individuals who believed that causing a scene would somehow make them important. But he had no time for that. Instead of responding angrily or making a scene himself, he simply stood still, looking the young man in the eyes. His calm demeanor only seemed to anger the thug more. The young man took a step forward, his posture aggressive. "Old man, you don't scare me," he said, laughing. It was clear now that he was looking for trouble. He wanted to prove something, to show that he could intimidate anyone, even a veteran. His eyes flickered toward the royal guards, perhaps thinking they wouldn't intervene. After all, they were only there to stand watch, weren't they? But Mr. Thompson could sense the danger. He had been trained to deal with situations like this. He knew when to act and when to stay calm. He wasn't going to back down from someone who thought they could push others around. He took a step back and raised his hands, signaling that he wasn't looking for a fight. But the young man wasn't finished yet. With a sudden, angry shout, the thug lunged forward. He swung his fist toward Mr. Thompson, the punch aimed directly at his face. The crowd gasped, some people pulling back in fear, while others held their breath. No one expected things to escalate so quickly. As the punch came closer, time seemed to slow down. But Mr. Thompson's years of experience kicked in. In one smooth motion, he sidestepped the punch, easily avoiding it. The thug, off balance from his own movement, stumbled forward. For a moment, he was completely vulnerable, and it became clear that he had made a huge mistake. The crowd was stunned into silence. What had just happened? No one had expected the situation to take such a turn. The young man, now realizing that his attack had failed, looked around, trying to regain his composure. But it was too late. The veteran had already shown him that he was not someone to be messed with. The young man stood there, his body awkwardly tilted forward after missing the punch, trying to steady himself. He blinked in confusion, his mind racing to process what had just happened. For a brief moment, he hesitated, unsure of how to react. But pride and anger quickly replaced his surprise, and he straightened up with a scowl. He had never been outmaneuvered like that before, especially by someone much older than him. "You think you're clever, old man?" The thug spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You can't just go around telling people what to do, especially not me." Mr. Thompson didn't respond. Instead, he stood with a calm expression, his posture relaxed, as if the whole thing was beneath him. He had seen countless arguments, had dealt with countless dangerous situations in his life, and none of them required words or unnecessary drama. The best way to deal with a person like this was simply to remain composed and let them expose themselves. The crowd was still and silent, unsure of what would happen next. Some people exchanged nervous glances, while others watched intently, their phones still raised, ready to capture every moment. No one knew how far this confrontation would go, but everyone felt the tension rising in the air. Even the royal guards, though they remained stoic and unmoving, seemed to shift their focus slightly, as if they were waiting for the right moment to act. The young man's frustration grew with each passing second. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone who looked like an easy target. He had assumed that, with his loud attitude and flashy clothes, he could control the situation. But now he felt foolish, angry at himself for losing his cool in front of a crowd. He took another step forward, his fist clenched tightly. "Don't just stand there like you're some kind of statue," the thug snapped. "You think you're tough. Why don't you show me then?" There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The tourists, many of whom had never witnessed a situation like this before, remained frozen in place. Some whispered to each other, wondering what would happen next. Mr. Thompson, still calm, took a deep breath. His military training had taught him to control his emotions, especially in moments of conflict. He knew that raising his voice or engaging in an argument wouldn't help anyone. So, instead of speaking, he once again stood motionless, waiting for the young man to make his next move. The thug, clearly expecting a different reaction, let out an angry yell and threw another wild punch. This time, however, his aim was even worse than before. The punch was sloppy, rushed, and filled with nothing but raw emotion. He was trying to regain control of a situation that was quickly slipping out of his grasp. Without hesitation, Mr. Thompson moved swiftly. With the grace of someone who had spent years learning to read a situation, he sidestepped the punch once more. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the thug's arm, twisting it with just the right amount of pressure. The thug gasped in pain as he found himself held in a tight grip, his arm now pinned behind his back. The crowd watched in awe as the young man struggled against the veteran's hold, but it was no use. Mr. Thompson had complete control of the situation, his years of experience showing in every move. The thug's bravado faded quickly as he realized how outmatched he truly was. The once confident, loud young man was now the one in trouble, struggling to free himself, while Mr. Thompson remained calm and composed. The scene was clear now. This wasn't just a random confrontation. It was a lesson in respect. As Mr. Thompson held the thug's arm behind his back, the young man grunted in pain. His face turned red with anger and frustration as he struggled, but he was no match for the veteran's strength and control. Every time he tried to free himself, Mr. Thompson simply applied more pressure, making it clear that any further attempts to resist would only make things worse for him. The crowd around them was still, watching in silence. Some tourists whispered to each other, their phones still pointed at the scene. Others simply stared in awe, unable to believe what they were seeing. It was rare to witness such a quick and calm response to aggression, and even more so when the person showing control was an older man. The veteran's actions were calm, calculated, and precise. He didn't shout or make a scene. He just acted. The young man, realizing that he wasn't going to win this physical battle, began to shout even louder. "Let go of me," he yelled, his voice shaky with a mix of pain and embarrassment. He could feel his pride slipping away with each passing second. The crowd, once watching with curiosity, now seemed to be waiting for the next step. The royal guards, still standing at attention nearby, hadn't moved, but their eyes were locked on the unfolding situation. It was clear they were waiting for any sign of violence that might require their intervention. "Calm down," Mr. Thompson said in a low, steady voice. "This doesn't have to go any further. You're not going to get anything out of this." His words were simple, but they carried weight. There was no anger or frustration in his tone, just a quiet, firm command that seemed to resonate with the young man. But instead of listening, the thug pulled harder, his movements becoming more desperate. The veteran's grip tightened just slightly, enough to make the young man wince in pain. "Stop," Mr. Thompson said again, this time more forcefully. "You've already made your point. Now it's time to let go of this nonsense." The thug's face twisted in frustration. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not in such a calm, controlled manner. He was used to getting his way, using his loud voice and aggressive behavior to dominate situations. But here, in front of the royal guards, in front of a crowd of people who were now watching him fail, he was powerless. After a few moments of struggle, the thug finally stopped pulling and stood still. His breathing was heavy, his pride wounded. He was no longer the loud, confident figure he had been moments before. Now he was simply a man caught in a situation he had no control over. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. Some people even clapped, appreciating the way Mr. Thompson had handled the situation with such grace and patience. The royal guards, while still silent and unmoving, exchanged a brief glance. They had been trained to stand firm and maintain order, but they also knew when someone else was handling things just fine. The young man stood there, defeated, as Mr. Thompson slowly released his grip. He wasn't free, but he was no longer in danger of further harm. It was a moment of quiet victory for the veteran, and for the onlookers, it was a lesson in how to remain calm and composed in the face of aggression. No words had been exchanged, no harsh actions taken, yet the message had been clear. Respect had been restored. After the brief but intense struggle, the young man stood still, his arms still held firmly by Mr. Thompson. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, and his body seemed to sag with the realization that he had been bested. But Mr. Thompson did not gloat or say anything harsh. He simply let the thug stand there, catching his breath. The crowd, still gathered around, began to murmur among themselves. Some were whispering in awe, while others seemed relieved that things hadn't escalated any further. The air was filled with a tense quiet, but no one dared to make a move. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Thompson didn't rush to speak. Instead, he simply released the thug's arm slowly, making sure the young man had space to step back. There was no anger in the veteran's eyes, no frustration. Just a calm, composed expression that came from years of experience. The young man, still shaken, stepped back quickly, rubbing his arm where the grip had been. He didn't make eye contact with Mr. Thompson, his confidence now completely shattered. He seemed to realize in that moment that he was no longer in control. "You should go," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his voice firm, but not harsh. "Before you make this worse." The words hung in the air for a moment before the young man finally turned away, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, not because of the physical hole, but because his pride had been broken. He had expected to intimidate the veteran, to show off in front of the crowd, but instead, he had been exposed as someone who didn't know how to handle himself in a real confrontation. As the young man walked away, the crowd's attention shifted. Some people watched him go with a sense of relief, while others exchanged knowing looks, as if they had just witnessed a powerful lesson. The royal guards, who had remained silent and unmoving throughout the entire exchange, finally relaxed their postures, though they remained watchful. They had seen plenty in their time, but even they couldn't ignore the strange calmness with which Mr. Thompson had handled the situation. Mr. Thompson didn't linger or seek any praise. He simply turned and began to walk away, blending into the crowd once again as if nothing had happened. It was clear that he wasn't interested in being the center of attention. For him, the situation had been about handling things with dignity and ensuring that the young man learned a lesson, not through violence or shouting, but through quiet strength and control. As he walked, a few people glanced at him with admiration, some even nodding their heads in respect. But the veteran did not notice. He had been in situations far more serious than this, and while this moment might have seemed dramatic to the onlookers, it was just another example of how to handle a person who didn't know how to respect others. The story of what had just happened would likely spread quickly. Tourists who had witnessed the incident would talk about it, and videos of the confrontation would surely make their way onto the internet. But for Mr. Thompson, it was simply another day. Another moment of peace restored with a quiet, steady hand. The young man, now defeated, slowly retreated from the scene. His steps were heavy, his body stiff with frustration and shame. He glanced back once, but quickly looked away as his eyes met those of the royal guards standing motionless just a few feet away. The guards, still silent and unblinking, had not moved a muscle throughout the entire confrontation. Their stoic expressions never wavered, as if they had seen this kind of thing before. It wasn't that they hadn't noticed what was happening, they had. The royal guards were trained to remain absolutely still and composed, no matter what occurred around them. They were part of a long tradition of discipline and honor, and their role was to protect the palace, not to get involved in every public disturbance. However, the moment the situation had escalated, it became clear that their presence was needed. As the young man moved farther away, Mr. Thompson, still calm, watched him go. The veteran didn't feel the need to follow him or add anything further to the exchange. The lesson had been given, and there was nothing more to say. However, the royal guard's role in the situation was far from over. They had been observing everything that had unfolded, and now they began to step forward, their movements slow and deliberate. One of the guards, the taller of the two, took a few steps closer to Mr. Thompson. He did not speak at first, but his gaze was steady and respectful. It was clear that the guard was assessing the situation, deciding if any further action was required. After a brief moment, the guard spoke in a deep, controlled voice. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, his tone polite, but with a hint of concern. It wasn't often that a situation like this occurred in front of them. They were used to standing watch without being involved in the drama of the crowds, but this was different. There was no mistaking the skill and calmness Mr. Thompson had shown in dealing with the young man. Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'm fine," he said simply. "Nothing to worry about." The other guard, who had remained silent until now, gave a brief nod, acknowledging that the situation had been resolved. There was no need for further interference. The guards knew their place, and they knew when others were capable of handling things without their involvement. The crowd, which had been holding its breath throughout the entire ordeal, began to loosen up. Some people quietly clapped, showing their appreciation for how well the situation had been managed. Others continued to take pictures and record videos, now more focused on the guards themselves. The moment, however, had passed, and the attention slowly shifted back to the usual flow of tourists admiring the palace. The royal guards, having made their presence known, returned to their original positions without any further words. They resumed their statue stances, unmoved by the earlier events, as if nothing had happened. It was a display of professionalism that mirrored Mr. Thompson's own quiet strength. As the tourists began to wander off, some still talking about the incident, Mr. Thompson slowly began to walk away as well. He knew that the lesson had been learned, not only by the young man who had caused the trouble, but also by the people who had witnessed the whole thing. It wasn't about violence or confrontation. It was about respect, control, and knowing how to handle a situation when things got out of hand. And in that moment, both the veteran and the royal guards had shown exactly how it should be done. As the young man walked away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the event was far from forgotten. People continued to talk in low voices, sharing their thoughts on what had just happened. Most were impressed by the calmness and control Mr. Thompson had shown, while others felt a bit uncomfortable with how quickly the situation had escalated. In the midst of all this, the young man walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind racing. He wasn't used to feeling like this, defeated, embarrassed, and unsure of what had just happened. In the past, when things didn't go his way, he could usually rely on his loud voice, his tough talk, and his ability to push people around. But today had been different. He had made a mistake, and that mistake was staring him in the face as he walked through the city. As he wandered down the cobblestone street, he couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in his mind. He had gone up to the old man, thinking he would intimidate him with his words, maybe even scare him a little, but that didn't happen. Instead, the old man had handled him like he was nothing, calmly, quietly, without a hint of anger. It had felt like a punch to his pride. The veteran didn't shout or make a scene. He just stood there, and that made the young man feel small, like all the power he had tried to display didn't matter at all. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how foolish he had been. Why had he let his temper get the best of him? He had been looking for attention, trying to show off in front of the crowd, and it had backfired in the worst way. Instead of being seen as strong, he had been shown up by an older man who hadn't even raised his voice. As he continued walking, he felt the weight of his actions. He had always prided himself on being tough, on being able to handle any situation. But today, that pride had been shattered in front of a crowd of strangers. He had acted out of anger, and it had cost him more than he had realized. It wasn't just his physical pride that had been bruised, but his ego too. He had thought he could control the situation, but instead, he had lost control entirely. He passed by a small cafe and saw his reflection in the glass window. For a moment, he barely recognized himself. His face was still red from the confrontation, and his posture was slouched. He looked tired, as if the weight of everything that had just happened had finally caught up with him. For the first time in a long while, he questioned his choices, his attitude, and the way he had lived his life up until now. The young man stopped walking and stood still for a moment. He wasn't sure what to do next. There was no one around to tell him what was right, no crowd to impress. All he could hear now was the quiet hum of the city around him. He sighed, realizing that the veteran had given him more than just a physical lesson. He had shown him something far more important, that sometimes true strength wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about knowing when to stay calm and control your own actions. He had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, he could start over and learn from this moment. The young man walked through the city for what felt like hours, but he hadn't really gone anywhere. His mind was still occupied with the events from earlier, replaying them over and over. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. Not just in trying to fight the old man, but in the way he had lived his life up until that point. All of his bravado, all of his loud words had gotten him nowhere. Eventually, he found himself at a small park, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of a large tree. The city around him continued to bustle, but here, in this quiet spot, he could finally think clearly. As he looked around, he noticed families enjoying the day, children playing, and elderly people walking slowly, chatting quietly. It was a peaceful scene, and for the first time that day, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He took a deep breath and leaned back against the bench, his gaze lifting to the sky. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly, and the gentle breeze carrying the sounds of distant laughter. The whole scene felt different now. He had always rushed through life, trying to prove something, but today he had learned that rushing through life didn't make you strong. It just made you tired. The young man thought about the veteran, Mr. Thompson. He hadn't been angry or aggressive. He hadn't tried to show off or make a scene. He had simply acted with quiet strength, handling the situation with a calmness that was almost unsettling. That was the lesson he had learned. Strength didn't come from shouting or fighting. It came from knowing how to control yourself, how to remain calm when everything around you seemed out of control. As he sat there, he realized that he had a lot of growing to do. His old habits, his quick temper, his need to always be the loudest in the room, they were all just a mask, a way to hide his insecurities. Today had stripped that mask away, and for the first time, he saw himself clearly. He wasn't as tough as he had thought. In fact, he had been foolish to think that acting tough would get him anywhere. The young man made a decision then. He wouldn't let that moment define him forever. Instead, he would learn from it. He would work on controlling his impulses, on thinking before he acted, and on building the kind of strength that came from within, not from shouting or fighting. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He stood up from the bench, feeling the weight lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that today had been a turning point. As he walked back through the park, he passed by people who seemed unaware of the small change that had just occurred in his life. But he knew that he had learned something important, something that would stick with him for a long time. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, the young man smiled to himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't perfect, and he still had a lot to learn, but he had taken the first step. And that was enough for now.